The wind carried the scent of dust, horses, and the restless murmur of a crowd as the sun dragged itself above the barren plains, turning the sky the color of old copper. Beneath that blazing dome hung a girl, no older than 17, her wrists bound, her feet barely brushing the wooden crate. Someone had kicked from beneath her moments before, leaving her dangling in front of the townspeople who hissed and spat the same word at her again and again. Thief. Her name was Mara, though no one cared to speak it. Not when she had been caught clutching a half-stale loaf of bread from the mercantile, her hands trembling, face pale. Matted hair falling around cheeks, hollowed by hunger so deep it clawed her ribs, like a starving wolf. And when the sheriff dragged her out into the dirt street before sunrise, she had not fought him, not even when the rope tightened around her neck, because she'd long ago learned that the world did not listen to the pleas of girls with no family, no land and no name worth protecting. But even then, even as the crowd jeered and someone threw a rotten tomato that burst upon her shoulder like an accusation, Mara kept her gaze fixed on the ground, refusing to let them see the shame that burned inside her like wildfire, the shame of having survived. On scraps since her mother's death the previous winter and her father's disappearance long before that, the shame of wandering into town that morning with a stomach so empty it trembled and a soul so tired she could barely stand. "This is justice," the sheriff barked, tightening the rope as another wave of murmurs rolled through the people. And though his voice boomed with authority, it lacked conviction, as if even he knew deep inside that hanging a starving girl for a loaf of bread was not justice but cruelty, wrapped in a badge, and yet he did nothing to stop it, because the law in Dustwater Ridge did not bend for the poor, only for those who could afford to buy its mercy. The sun climbed higher, burning into Mara's eyes as she struggled for breath, her vision spotting the sounds of the crowd, fading into a distant roar like ocean waves slamming against cliffs she had never seen. And somewhere at the edge of consciousness she wondered if this was how her mother had felt, too, when sickness strangled the life from her lungs, helpless, forgotten, unwanted. But just as the sheriff prepared to turn away, signaling the end, a low rumble echoed from the road, a single horse galloping with purpose, hooves pounding like thunder, and the crowd turned, as one to see a tall figure on a black stallion slicing through the morning glare, his duster coat whipping behind him, his broad shoulders casting a shadow longer than the street itself. Solomon Graves, the widowed rancher whose land stretched farther than most men could ride in a day, whose heart had been buried with his wife 3 winters ago, leaving him silent, brooding, and feared not because he was cruel, but because loss had carved him into stone. He dismounted without a word, boots crunching in the dirt, his cold grey eyes sweeping the scene, and a hush fell so sudden it was as if the air itself froze. No one dared speak when Solomon Graves was angry, and he was angry now, though he hid it beneath a stare so sharp it could slice steel. He approached Mara slowly, taking in the rope, the bruises on her wrists, the way her chest rose in shallow, desperate gasps, and something flickered across his face, something no one had seen in him since the death of his wife. Recognition, as though he were staring not at a stranger but at a mirror of suffering he himself once carried. "Sheriff," Solomon said, voice steady as bedrock, "what in God's name is this?" The sheriff swallowed hard, suddenly looking very small despite his badge. "Caught her stealing bread," he muttered, avoiding the rancher's eyes. "The law's the law." Solomon stepped closer, until his shadow engulfed the sheriff, and for a moment the only sound was Mara's strangled breathing. "Since when," Solomon said quietly, "do we hang children for being hungry?" The sheriff opened his mouth, but no words came. The rancher didn't wait, didn't ask permission, didn't care who protested. He reached up, wrapped his strong, calloused hand around the rope, and with one brutal jerk of his hunting knife, he cut it clean through, catching Mara just as her body collapsed, her weight folding like cloth in his arms, her lungs dragging in ragged, desperate breaths. Gasps rippled through the crowd. and someone sputtered in outrage. But when Solomon lifted his gaze, cold fury blazing like winter lightning, every complaint died in their throats. Still cradling the unconscious girl, he turned toward the sheriff. "If you want to punish someone," he said, "punish me, because I'm taking her." He brushed past the townspeople, who parted instantly, unwilling to challenge a man whose grief and power made him unpredictable, and carried Mara toward the horse trough, where he lowered her gently to the ground and cupped water in his hand, pressing it to her cracked lips until she coughed, sputtered, and blinked up at him with eyes full of confusion and fear. "Easy," he murmured softly, so softly that the sheriff, watching from afar, wondered if this was truly the same hardened rancher everyone believed had no soul left to give. "You're all right now." Mara tried to speak, but only a croak escaped as she clutched her throat, her voice stolen by the rope. And Solomon shook his head. "Don't talk yet, breathe." She obeyed, her breath trembling, tears gathering in her eyes as she whispered soundlessly, "Why?" Solomon answered the question she could not ask. Because no one should die for wanting to eat. And as he lifted her once more into his arms, her small frame dwarfed by his, he looked back at the silent crowd and said, "If any of you have a problem with this, you can ride out to my ranch and tell me to my face." Not a single soul moved. Not as he mounted his stallion with Mara held close. Not as he rode through the gates of Dustwater Ridge without a backward glance. And long after the dust settled, they would remember that moment, the day the widowed rancher cut down a starving girl and carried her away like a vow he intended to keep. But as Mara's head rested weakly against his chest, her eyes half open, she felt the weight of her guilt, her fear, and something else too, a fragile flicker of hope she did not yet understand, a hope that would change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. And as the ranch disappeared into the golden horizon, the townspeople would speak of it again and again, though none would fully grasp the truth. This was not an act of charity alone, but the beginning of a story forged from hunger, redemption, and the unexpected kindness of a man whose heart had been silent far too long. And as the sky dimmed behind them, Mara, still faint, still aching, felt her eyes close fully at last, surrendering to the warmth of the man who had saved her, not because he had to, but because something inside him refused to let another soul die alone. Mara woke to the crackling whisper of a fire, and the scent of something warm, real food, not the stale scraps she had trained her stomach to endure, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. She blinked against the dim light, her throat raw, her muscles heavy as if she were still hanging from that rope. But the softness beneath her was no hard-packed dirt, but a quilted bed in a small wooden room, sunlight slanting through the window like golden ribbons dancing across the floor. And when she tried to sit up, a hand, steady, firm, gentle, pressed against her shoulder and eased her back. "Don't force it," came Solomon's deep voice, and her gaze followed the sound to where he sat beside her, sleeves rolled to his elbows, shadows of exhaustion under his eyes, as though he had been watching her for hours without rest. He handed her a bowl of stew, thick, steaming, fragrant, with vegetables and herbs so different from the empty air that had been her only meal for days. And yet Mara hesitated, fingers trembling, unsure if she should touch it, unsure if it was truly meant for her. She had learned in the streets that kindness often came with a cost she could not afford. Solomon seemed to read her fear. "Don't worry about anything except eating," he said softly, setting the bowl into her hands. "You're safe here." But safety was a word Mara had never fully understood. And as she lifted the spoon to her lips, her tears mixed with the steam, when dropping into the broth before she could stop it, she whispered a rasped apology, embarrassed by the display. But Solomon shook his head. "Food tastes better with tears," he murmured, his eyes distant, as though speaking from memories he rarely let surface. And Mara wondered what ghosts haunted him, what loss carved those lines in his face, what sorrow turned his gaze toward someone who no longer walked the earth. She ate, slowly at first, afraid to appear greedy. But her body betrayed her once the first taste hit her tongue, warmth blooming like life itself. She devoured the stew with a hunger so fierce she trembled, spoon clattering against the bowl as she scraped every last drop. And through it all, Solomon said nothing, simply watching with the quiet patience of a man who knew what starving felt like, who had perhaps starved in ways that had nothing to do with food. When she finished, he took the bowl gently, as if afraid she might think he was taking something precious away, and set it on a small wooden table before pulling his chair closer. "You don't have to talk yet," he told her, "but when you can, I want to know everything, who you are, what happened, why you were alone." She lowered her gaze, voice still a raw whisper. "There's not much to tell." Solomon leaned his elbows on his knees, eyes steady. "Everyone has a story. Mara, yours matters." The simple certainty in his tone shook her more than the hanging rope had, because no one, not since her mother's passing, had ever spoken as though her life held worth. Slowly, painfully, she began. She told him of the winter that stole her mother, of the debt collectors who chased her father, until he vanished into the mountains and never returned, of the nights she slept beneath wagons and the days she begged for work, only to be shoved aside, of the hunger that twisted her insides into knots so sharp she thought it might kill her before the rope ever did. She confessed how her fingers had closed around that loaf of bread, almost without permission, driven by desperation rather than malice, and how the townspeople had looked at her, not as a girl, but as a problem, an inconvenience, a mouth not worth feeding. Solomon listened without interrupting, his expression darkening like gathering storm clouds, and when she finished he exhaled a long breath, rubbing his jaw as though weighing something inside himself. "You deserved help," he said, voice low, "not punishment." But Mara shook her head, her fingers twisting in the blanket. "You shouldn't have saved me," she whispered, fighting back another wave of tears. "People will come for you. The sheriff, the town. They'll say you interfered with the law." Solomon straightened, his eyes sharpening with steel. "Let them try." The words carried a finality that left no room for doubt, and Mara felt her breath catch, not out of fear, but something dangerously close to gratitude. He helped her stand, guiding her to the ranch's main room, where sunlight pooled on wooden floorboards and shelves lined with books, tools and relics of a life lived in both silence and sorrow. Then he led her to the table, where a fresh piece of warm bread lay beside butter and honey, and said the words that would echo through her soul for the rest of her life. "Eat first. Everything else can wait." But even as she obeyed, tearing off a piece of the soft loaf, the world outside his ranch was shifting. Dustwater Ridge was not a place that forgot an insult quickly, and Solomon's defiance had been loud, public, unforgettable. By noon, whispers slithered through the saloon like snakes, twisting into rumors, accusations and warnings. The sheriff, red-faced and furious, paced behind his desk as men demanded to know why. He'd let the rancher humiliate him, while others muttered that a girl who stole once could steal again, that Solomon was a fool driven by ghosts to risk his own name. Some wanted the girl brought back, others wanted her gone, and a few, men with darker intentions and shorter tempers, wanted the rancher punished for challenging the order of the town. Solomon seemed to sense the storm brewing, even before the dust clouds carried the sound of approaching horses faintly across the plains. He paused as he split a log outside, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, jaw tightening. Mara watched from the porch, fear curling through her like a cold hand. But he turned to her with a calm steadiness she had never seen in any man. "Whatever happens," he said, "you stay behind me. No one's taking you back there, not while I'm breathing." She believed him, not because of his strength, though it was undeniable, but because of the conviction in his voice, the quiet fire that burned beneath his grief, like embers waiting to rise into flame. As the riders approached, their silhouettes dark against the blazing sky, Mara felt her pulse quicken, her throat tightening, not with the rope this time, but with the realization that someone had chosen to fight for her. truly fight, and she didn't know how to carry the weight of that gift. She barely knew how to carry hope. Still, she stepped closer to Solomon, her small hand brushing his sleeve, and though she said nothing, the look she gave him spoke more loudly than any words. "Thank you. I don't know why you saved me, but thank you." And before the riders reached the ranch gate, Solomon whispered without looking at her, "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in years, Mara believed it.